There are not too many women involved in aviation, but it sure seems like when they come around, they are special. Sonja is from Germany and is an engineer. She has made extensive modifications to her Pulsar, and everyone around the tarmac was pretty impressed with her work and ideas. Here is Sonja Englert of Englewood, Colorado.
I'm Sonja Englert, and this is my Pulsar. I'm an aeronautical engineer, and I've worked for a lot of years on small airplanes. I've helped building airplanes, and I know a lot about composite, so that's kind of my specialty. Well, I'm from Germany, and I worked in a lot of different places. Before I came here, I worked in Switzerland and Malaysia and a little bit in Germany. And then there were some interesting jobs in this country. At that time in Germany, there wasn't much going on in aviation, so I came over here and joined a company in Florida, modifying Moonis, doing STCs, engine conversions, and I was there for 5 years. It's a lot better to fly in this country because there's a lot less restrictions. You can take off and land at any airport, even if there's no one controlling the traffic like you have to in Germany. It's a lot less expensive. You don't have to pay landing fees on most airports. The fuel is much less expensive, and there are no borders close by. Like you have to fly in different countries in Europe because they're so small, and every time you have to land at a custom airport and go through customs. And here you can just fly for hours and hours and still be in the same country and no one bothers you. The airports don't close really. You can land at any time of the day or night and nobody cares. In Germany, if you're landing after the airport officially closes, they'll charge you a lot. They're building Homebuilts in Europe as well, in Germany and France and all the other countries. It's more difficult for them there because they don't have something like we have here as experimental, that the builder takes all the responsibility and just builds it and gets it inspected once and flies it. In Germany, for example, you still have to go through a process that's similar to a simplified certification of a home build. You have to do some testing, some flight testing, structural testing, and verify that your airplane is safe. So it takes a lot more time and effort to do a home build in Germany, for example, than it does here. I've had it for 1 year now, and it's been really a fun airplane so far, although I put a lot of work in it. I bought it in Montana 1 year ago, and I flew it back to Florida, where I lived at that time. It was quite an exciting trip because things had to be fixed on the way, and I visited a lot of places. I flew first to Oregon, then down California, through Arizona and New Mexico, and back to Florida. And when I got home, I took the plane apart. It used to have a nose wheel, and I took the nose wheel off and put a tail wheel on it, which is all my design. I had to move the main gear forward so that it wouldn't fall over, and that took quite a lot of work. Then I did some other things to it, like I installed a firewall. I modified the instrument panel and had not enough instruments in there. It needed a manifold pressure gauge because it has a controllable pitch prop. This one's in-flight adjustable. So I made a whole lot of changes to this airplane. Then one other thing I did is, you can see it better this way, modified the cowling, the inlets of it. They're much smaller than of other Pulsars. With this and the tail wheel conversion gave me a better speed. I'm about 5 to 8 knots faster now that I'm done with the modifications. When I decided to buy an airplane, I looked at several designs, and one of my criteria was it had to be, the wings had to be removable. On the Pulsar, it's fairly easy. You take out a few bolts out of the wing spars and disconnect a few lines and fittings, and then you can remove the wings. The other airplane I had looked at was a Mustang II, which is a side-by-side metal airplane, very similar to the Pulsar, although it has more horsepower. And at first I looked at several Mustangs, but I couldn't find a good one. So I ended up deciding, actually I know more about composite airplanes, and this is what I ended up with. And you notice that horse on the tail, because it's not quite a Mustang, I decided it's a pony and it needed a pony on the tail. I've flown a lot of Mooney, Piper Cub as tail dragger. I've flown a lot of gliders and motor gliders, and I would compare it the most to high performance gliders because it's very sensitive on the controls and it glides fairly well even with the engine off. It's a very clean airframe, and it's a lot more fun because you see much better out of this big canopy. It's also a lot like those gliders that I flew, where you sit in front of the wing and you have this big view of everything. That's just great on this plane. Well, the most hours in one type that I have are Mooney otherwise. And the Mooney has, of course, twice the horsepower and is a little faster, but it burns at least twice the fuel. So this one flies almost as fast as a Mooney on half the fuel burn. That's, of course, one thing I like very much. It's a Rotax 912 and it's got the high compression pistons. I've been fairly happy with this engine. It performs very well. It's running smooth. It uses very little gas and very little oil. And because it's a geared engine, the prop is turning fairly slow, so it's not very noisy. And also inside the cockpit is fairly quiet, this airplane. It's liquid cooled, so you're running it at lower temperatures than an air-cooled engine, which I think should increase the life of the engine also. The gear, when it still had the nose wheel, the main gear was much further aft, about back here. And in order to have sufficient load on the tail wheel, I had to move it forward. So I cut a slot in the fuselage down there, because it's one continuous piece, the whole gear. Took it out through the bottom. I had to cut another slot in the fuselage up front here and put it back in. I reinforced the fuselage inside the frame where the new gear mounting bracket mounts to. It's got two supports left and right that keep it from moving away. And then I put a fairing around the gear legs to streamline it. I closed the slot that I cut both forward and aft to get the structure back. Since I'm an engineer and I've got quite a bit of experience with composite, I designed this gear conversion and built it also myself. And it wasn't really difficult. The most difficult part was getting in there underneath the instrument panel, and there's very little space, the opening there to get in there, and trying to put the new gear fittings in that limited space. I looked at that gear and I decided there are a couple of things that I didn't like too much about it. One is the tail wheel is a little bit flimsier than the one that I put on, and I wanted the tail to be a little higher so that it has more ground clearance and that I have better visibility over the nose. So I angled the spring down further, and I'm really happy with that part. Then the other thing is the other Pulsars with the tail wheel have the main gear about 4 inches further aft, which means they have less load on the tail wheel, and when they brake, the airplane might come nose down. On this one, it doesn't do that. I can use full brakes as hard as I can and it still stays with the tail on the ground. That's why. And of course, I had the most space there in front of the seat frame to put the main gear. That was convenient also. The fuel tanks are right here in the leading edge, and the fuel tank fittings are right aft of my main gear, so that doesn't interfere with this gear location. if I had tried to put it further aft, it would have interfered with the fuel tank. When I thought about making this into a tail dragger, I looked at the other Pulsar tail draggers, and I noticed that the tail is really close to the ground and that their attitude is kind of steep, that when you're sitting in there, you're looking at the sky. So I decided I wanted my tail to be a little further off the ground so that I can see better and it's further away from any obstacles that might be there. So I took a Cessna 170 tail spring and a Matco tail wheel from Aircraft Spruce and mounted them together and jigged the tail up to where I wanted it to be, and that determined the angle that I wanted the tail wheel to be at. And I wanted it to be steerable also, so I hooked these chains to the rudder actuation in there so that I move this, the tail wheel moves. Makes it much easier to control the airplane on the ground. Let me say something about the ground handling with this gear. I'm very happy with this because the tail wheel is steerable now. The nose wheel was not steerable, and especially in a crosswind you have to stand on one brake to keep taxiing straight. Now I just use the rudder pedals to steer it, which is much easier, I think. For takeoff, I try to keep the tail wheel on the ground because the attitude of the airplane is exactly the takeoff attitude. I try not to let it come up. It does want to come up, but if I keep it on the ground, I have better control and it takes off and climbs right out at the right speed and right attitude. I modified this cowling a little bit also because I noticed that the original cowlings are very large. Their openings are down here and up here, and that's a lot of drag, and really all that air that would want to go in there is not able to go in there. It just spills out again. So I've done this on a few other airplanes too, modified the cowlings, made the inlet smaller to reduce the drag and still maintain the engine cooling. So I brought this down a little further and I brought this edge up and I rounded it out and built a diffuser on the inside to slow the air down that's coming in and build up the pressure inside. So this saved me quite a bit of drag, I think, and that's one reason why it's faster now. And let me take the cowling off and then you can see on the inside what it looks like. I also did a few things in the engine compartment. First of all, I made the cowling easier to remove with quick turn fasteners instead of screws. Then you can see my inlet modification. I extended the lid here that reduces the drag. I wrapped the exhaust with this fiberglass wrapping to keep the heat inside the exhaust and not the engine compartment. I installed a stainless steel firewall on this airplane because the original firewall is not really a firewall. It's just composite and it would burn. So I feel much safer having a piece of steel there. I had to remove everything from the engine compartment except the engine itself to have enough access to put the firewall in. I also swapped the radiator. I had a large radiator in there originally, and because the firewall moved it a little bit further forward, it didn't fit anymore, so I had to put a small Rotex radiator in it. And I must say, there's nothing wrong with that. The engine runs still cool enough. So, and it's lighter. It saved me a few pounds, which I put in the firewall, of course, so in the end, it's probably still heavier than before. When I designed those inlets, first of all, I had to make sure that it doesn't interfere with the engine itself. So I tried to keep it clear of the exhaust. For example, I made a little bulge around the fuel pump, which sticks out beyond the area of the spinner here. I had to make some pieces removable so that I can get to the oil sensor probes, for example, and on the other side to the oil filter. And basically, I eyeballed the size of the inlets. I made it look nice. That's one objective. And then I was fairly confident that the size would be right because I had done a similar modification on another airplane. And it usually isn't all that critical, the size. It's more critical how you smooth the airflow inside the cowling. And That's why I extended the lips here instead of having them cut off right there as they are on the standard Pulsar cowling. The air goes turbulent over that edge and doesn't flow very well through the engine compartment. So it's kind of a bit of eyeballing and experience with other airplanes where I measure temperatures on the engine and climb. Climb is the critical case. You need to get enough air through the engine there. And it worked out pretty well. It's the same temperature as it is before with the large openings and the large radiator. Ideally, you would size the inlets so that at your climb speed you have exactly the air going through that inlet at the speed you're flying, and at any higher speed air would start spilling out because it can't flow fast enough through the radiator. But at climb you want to have the maximum airflow, so that's what you size the inlets for. Of course, it's a bit of guesswork to know how much air it needs at climb. Some engine manufacturers give you numbers, but on this one I really had to guess. There is no numbers available. Unfortunately, I did both changes at the same time, and I measured the performance before with the large cowling inlets and with the nose gear. Then I measured it again with the smaller inlets and the tail wheel. So I can only say that both together resulted in a speed increase between 5 and 9 knots, depending on the power setting. So that's pretty good. I cleaned up the airframe in some other areas too, and had a huge wing walk, and I recessed the fuel tank drain fittings that were sticking out like this far. Now they're almost flush. So I did a few little other things to it that cleaned it up, but the main changes were the cowling and the tail wheel. And I still want to put a fairing on the tail wheel that I haven't done yet. I haven't had a chance. This engine is a Rotax 912. The previous owner installed high compression pistons, so it's similar to the 912S, although it's not quite the same. The 912S has a few different features. It has a different gear reduction, but it doesn't make much difference. So I should have 95 horsepower on this engine. Yeah, I've flown with Lycoming and Continental engines and also Volkswagen engine. And what I really like about this is the electronic ignition. It makes the engine start really well. It's like you turn the switch and boom, it runs. And other than that, I like that it's a geared engine. It makes it quieter. The prop is turning slower than the engine is running. And that way also the engine size can be kept smaller because it runs at a higher RPM. It seems like the ignition is fairly reliable. It's got a separate circuit from the generator that doesn't even go to the airplane bus first. It's got a separate cable to the ignition, so that even if you lose your electricity in the airplane, the ignition would still get power from the generator. It's got dual spark plugs per cylinder, so that's the redundancy there. There are two of these ignition boxes. One fires one half of the spark plugs and the other one for the other half of the spark plugs. So I think it's more reliable than a magneto. I've had a problem with a magneto failure, but I have not had a problem with this electronic ignition. The Pulsar, first of all, is a very efficient plane. It burns very little gas and it's going really fast for the horsepower that it has installed. It's fairly small in size, so you can squeeze it somewhere in a hangar in a corner. It's easy to fly. Even low-time pilots shouldn't have trouble with it. Actually, the previous owner I bought this from was a student pilot when he bought it, and he flew it as a student. And also, when I got my insurance for this plane, the insurance told me that they had such a good accident record, these Pulsars, that the rate is fairly low on the insurance. So they seem to be pretty safe airplanes, easy to fly, performing very well. And it's just a fun cross-country airplane. You have great visibility in it, and I can only recommend it to anyone.